So today we got a 79 Midget in the shop and we're going to do an inspection of it to show you what to look for if you're going to go buy yourself a Midget, or if you already have one, some of the things to take a closer look at to know a little bit more about your car. So I could tell immediately that this car had been repainted before, but being a body man, that's really easy for me to spot. Now, if you don't know what you're looking for, one of the quick and easy signs on this particular car to know is, being a rubber bumper car, from this molding down should always be black. They would have been black from the factory, as well as the whole bottom of the fender here. Since all that stuff is not black, that's an obvious sign of a respray. Now, as far as exterior rust, things to look for, this spot here is usually the very first spot that'll start showing rust on the outer body. Now we'll take a little closer look at both sides and show you that this one has been repaired and how I can tell you it's been repaired. Now, other than obvious waves and various, imperfections in the area and the paint and bubbles and stuff, one way I can tell that this has been repaired is if you look really closely at the body lines here, which it doesn't show up quite as well on camera as it looks in person, but right there, from this point forward, you see it changed, the line changed and start going off at an angle. And then on the other side, going at the same angle. So this is a replacement patch piece that isn't quite bent square, it's sort of trapezoidal. So it's been repaired from there down. Now, same thing on this side here, which is the left side. We got a couple bumps here that's kind of an indication, but you also see right here, where as it comes down, it really starts shooting off at an angle there, saying that that is definitely a patch panel that's been laid in here. So while this is usually the very first spot on the exterior body that you can see signs of rust, the second spot is usually right back in here, right above this seam here. You'll see some bubbling getting started there. And then the next spot is usually right down in this area in here. You'll start seeing some bubbling here. Now, one of the other areas that maybe doesn't show up as early is this area in here. Along the bottom here can rust, because the way the trunk floor comes in, up way up about here, and then it just goes straight down and creates there's a big pocket here that dirt, leaves, or anything in the trunk can get into and hold water, and then that can rust right there. So one of the other areas that these are very rust prone is the very front of the bonnet here. And you can see this one was rusted out and they just painted right over all the rust and didn't even try to repair it. Water can get trapped in here and just rot out both corners on both sides. So it is kind of difficult here in a rust belt to find decent used bonnets because they're almost always rotted out across the front. So we can tell this car used to be carmine red because they forgot to trim the masking tape across here when they taped off that decal. And we got some, the hinges are still carmine red. And another thing about color changes you see all the time, they just painted the engine compartment here flat black. That's one of my pet peeves. I really do not like that. But this being a 1500 and showing 70,000 miles on it, you would figure that the engine is either getting ready to be done or it's already been gone through, because these engines don't oil real well to the number 3 rod bearings, and they'll tend to spin a bearing right about 60,000 miles. And one of the jokes I like to make about this motor is you could pretty much just set your watch to them. 57 to 62,000 miles, they're going to need to be done. So another indication that the engine might have been rebuilt is the valve cover is silver. Now, while in England you guys are used to seeing the silver valve covers, here in America they were all red. Actually, it was more of an orangish red, but officially they were red here in America. And when you see all this damage here, across here, That's usually not crash damage. That's usually from them getting the engine out and doing an engine change, or pulling the engine out and putting it in. And one of the other problems the 1500 tends to have is the manifold tends to crack. This manifold has been replaced with a header, not terribly uncommon, but one of the interesting things about buying these headers is they don't hook up really easily to the rest of the exhaust system without having an exhaust guide bend up pieces to make everything fit. And then the original air cleaner is missing off of this car. These carburetors tend to not like no air cleaners or these aftermarket air cleaners. They like the restriction of the original air filter to work properly. Not saying you can't make them run right, but it's a lot easier with the original air filter. Now in this case here, just like almost every Stromberg that comes in, there is no oil at all in this carburetor. So it's probably been adjusted too rich. It smelled like it was running too rich when he brought it in. So that's one of the things I will be addressing while it's in the shop. Now the other thing about the 1500s versus the 1275 cars is the 1275s and earlier all have oil pressure gauges. The 1500s don't. All they have is a low pressure oil light. And this is the sensor for it down here. So if this is unhooked, which I've seen that before, or is bad, that light will not work. And the only way to verify oil pressure to know what you have is to take this out and actually hook up an adapter and the line to a manual gauge that you can look at under the hood here. Now one of the other things I'm going to have to look at on this particular car is we got no brake fluid whatsoever in it on either side. So while we're looking at it, I'm also going to pull the drums, see if the wheel cylinders are leaking, but there's going to be more than just wheel cylinder problem because both sides are empty. So I might have to put brake fluid in it and push on the brakes and see if we see any leaks at the master cylinder or somewhere else in the car. Now, the customer who owns this car bought it a number of years ago, but he's never actually really used the car hardly at all because the ignition switch, the key gets stuck in it. So he's afraid to really drive it anywhere and use it for anything if he's going to do anything but just drive around the block and come back home. So the car is sat a lot, and it's been sitting long enough now that when he went to get it out, he had no brakes. So that's another reason why it's here. Now, if you're looking at one of these things and you can get it up in the air to look at it from underneath, definitely do that, especially if you're paying anywhere near the actual market value of the car. So this car here has had tie rods put on it, but the quality of some of the aftermarket stuff these days, the boots can rot off pretty quickly. This one has already. And then you want to look at the condition of the boots here, because it's not a super simple job to put a rack in it if it's dried out and had any real wear in it. And you want to look for leaks right here on the shocks on both sides and bounce the car, see if it bounces too much. But just like the B, the lower kingpins here can seize if they're not lubricated regularly. And then it can wear the A-arm out here to where you're basically replacing the whole A-arm, or the kit they give you to do this, you're actually welding in a new sleeve here. Now, because the A-arms are stamped sheet metal, sometimes when they've been towed, they'll grab a hold of these things with hooks and bend the backs of the A-arms. And you want to look for that as well. And because the way the anti-roll bar here is mounted, sometimes these can get caught on things on the road and get bent as well as bending the front of the arm. And of course, going back through here, these things always leak. Doesn't matter which engine you have in it, they leak. That's, like I said before, I think it's obligatory on a British car. Now this particular one here, the floors are in actually very good condition. He's got a very solid car. floors are pretty susceptible on these to rust. So usually you start out, any car would be starting in the footwell because of wet feet, and then work its way back. Now, midgets in particular, it's very difficult to get to the drive shaft because it's above this panel. But on the 1500 cars, they did give you this opening that you can get in there, making it at least a little bit easier to work on it than the earlier cars. Now, another indication that this car has had the engine out of it is this cable here. This is actually the steady cable, or the stay cable. It's supposed to be connected up to the bell housing right here, and its job is to keep the engine from sliding forward in an accident. But it looks like somebody must have thought it was just a ground cable or something, because they connected it up to there where it's absolutely not going to do its job. Now the 1500 has the slave cylinder on this side here, and it slides in. They're a little finicky to get in to work on, but the 1275 and earlier cars, they were over here, where it's kind of difficult to get in there and work on them, and you go through a hole with a plug in it in here to bleed them. So they're a little bit interesting to do. And we got a electrical connection here that's not connected. I'd have to double check the wire collars. I don't remember if that's backup lights or something else. I'll look into that while we're got it. But if you got an earlier car, especially really early Bug-Eye Sprites and early midgets, this area in here is very critical because they only had quarter elliptic springs and they were clamped in up here. So this was the only connection to the body shell for the spring to come down, because they didn't go all the way back. Later cars, they put half elliptic springs in here, and it was much less stress on this section because it shared the load with an area back here. And of course, gas tanks, you always want to look at your gas tank. Of course, if they rust, it's usually going to be on the top, not the sides. But these, when the sending units go bad on these, the sending units in the top of the gas tank, so you have to drop the gas tank in order to replace it, unlike the MGB where it's on the side. So now that we're under the car, we'll show you how this corner of the trunk floor comes together. This area here is a hollow section in behind there. So anything within the trunk, leaves, dirt, whatever, can get back in there and drop in here and hold moisture. That's why they can rust in this area here. So of course you also want to look at the condition of your exhaust system. This one's actually in really good condition, aside from some fine gumball welding when it was installed. But you know, it's not leaking. You know, it'll suffice. And all these little hangers here, like the way this is hung here, it's putting a lot of stress on this because it's not in the right spot. But that's probably going to tear sometime. The other thing you want to look at is the rear shocks. See if they're leaking around in this area here too. So now this is the later, obviously being 79, the later setup for the parking brake cables here. Now the early setup had a pivot here and rods going both ways. Now that stuff is not really available in all the correct pieces and can be a little difficult to piece together if you're missing that stuff. But if you got an early one, you want to make sure that pivot is actually moving and none of that stuff is too wore out. Okay. Well, we put a little bit of brake fluid in the reservoir and now we know where it's leaking. All that on the floor, because inside the wheel well here, there is what they call a pressure differential warning assembly right here. There's supposed to be a switch right here, and what it does is it kicks a light on the dash when there's a difference in pressure between the front brakes and the rear brakes. Now, replacing that switch will do absolutely nothing to stop it from leaking. It's the seals within the unit itself, and it needs rebuilt. Now, yes, you can put a really stubby bolt in there with a copper washer and it will stop it from leaking, but it still needs rebuilt. The kit is really, less than 20 bucks, and it's really easy to do.